see you. Good to see you.
By the way, this is Nico Perino of Fire, by the way.
So, Matt, last year in May, you and I had a conversation on Fire's, so to speak, podcast about the collective freakout that it seemed talking heads and mainstream media were having to the prospect that Elon Musk might take over Twitter. Fast forward 7 months, and somehow you are in Twitter's files, doing the Twitter files. Can you just explain a little bit how that came to be?
Yeah, that was totally random. I did at one point suggest in a column that if he were to open up the internal correspondence of Twitter, that he would become an American folk hero. But the rumor was kind of already going around that he was thinking about doing that. So maybe a little bit, I was hoping that he would see that. And I was sort of raising my hand and volunteering. But it was very random. I got called by Twitter, and as you know, many other reporters soon got involved. And initially, we didn't think we were looking at much. And after about a week and a half was when we realized we were looking at something very significant.
Yeah, can you talk about your approach to that reporting too? Did you go out to San Francisco? Did you go to the offices? And how do you even begin to look at that trove of data?
I did go out to San Francisco, and the only guidance that we had really was with the first Twitter files, because I talked about that with the Twitter executives. My idea with that was I was still thinking kind of old school First Amendment. I wasn't thinking in Orwellian terms. I was thinking in terms of sort of American speech law. And I was thinking if there was some kind of communication between something like the FBI and Twitter, what would those communications look like? I figured the place we would most likely find that, if it existed, was in the Hunter Biden laptop incident, because Mark Zuckerberg had mentioned, sort of obliquely being warned about that. But after that, there was really no guidance. We just sort of had a whole gigantic pile of stuff, and it was from that we had to build a plot of what we were looking at. That's one of the reasons I was very glad for the Missouri v. Biden lawsuit, because they came to a lot of the same conclusions we did sort of independently, and that was reassuring.
So for folks who followed Matt, he has a very helpful capsule summary of all the Twitter files on your website, which I used to kind of help prepare for this conversation. But in doing the Twitter files, what surprised you the most? What did you find that was just more shocking than anything else?
So, how many people here have ever seen the movie All the President's Men? Yeah, everybody. Great journalism movie, right? Alan J. Pakula. There's this scene in it where Robert Redford is at the arraignment of the Watergate burglars, and right at the end he hears one of the burglars, James McCord, when he's asked what he does for a living, he sort of whispers Central Intelligence Agency, and Robert Redford immediately kind of, his eyes light up. He can't believe what he's looking at, and he whispers a little expletive. We had that moment, I would say, a week and a half into the project. We had already started seeing emails that were saying things like flagged by FBI, flagged by DHS. But for me, it was the first time I saw an email that had this thing they called the industry meeting. So there would be, the header of the email would be usually a government official from the FBI or some other government agency. Then there would be 30 or 40 representatives of private companies, and they range from Pinterest to Wikimedia to Google to Facebook to Twitter. And then there would be an agenda underneath it. And it would say U.S. government briefing, beginning with like other government agency briefing on Ukraine. So that's like the intelligence community sort of talking to all of these companies about, sort of briefing them on trends. That was shocking to me because that showed the entire arrangement in one picture. And from there we were able to kind of construct more about how the communication worked. But that was the real big shock for me.
Yeah, there was some recent news that I read as well, coming out of some of these congressional hearings, about how I guess American law enforcement is passing along requests from the Ukrainian intelligence service to these companies. And from best we can tell, they're not vetting them at all. And I don't know how much they're asking them to do anything with it. But it is concerning, that sort of interaction, right?
Oh my God.
Yeah, and just, you know, especially with the threat of revoking Section 230 and some of the other sort of reforms that government has been threatening social media companies in particular with. It's important, I think, even after the Twitter files has kind of waned, that we're still shedding light on some of these activities. And I did want to ask you about the Twitter files waning, right? Mm-hmm. Because over the course of the last couple of months, some of the journalists who were involved in the Twitter files reporting were no longer involved. Barry Weiss, for example, criticized Elon Musk for his deplatforming of some journalists. And then your Twitter files reporting ended when you criticized Elon Musk's approach to Substack, which at the time was launching a mini Twitter competitor. And you have strong allegiances to Substack. Your journalism is hosted there. And I will say, for anyone who cares about journalism and freedom of speech, Substack is some of our greatest partners there, Chris and Hamish, and they're just fantastic, and they care deeply about these issues. So can you talk a little bit about how that ended, and Elon sharing some of your private correspondences with him? And
yeah, I mean, that was sad. I mean, but Elon's a complicated person. He's got things going on in his professional life that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The initial interview that I had with him, I can't say that I fully understood what he wanted out of the Twitter files. He talked about hoping to restore some credibility to the platform for people who were unsure of what was going on behind the scenes, and I think the Twitter files to some degree helped on that front because it showed some willingness to be open. But it ended in acrimonious fashion, which I think was too bad. I was trying to protect the reporting by remaining independent. I thought if there was any kind of relationship between us that we'd be criticized even more. He didn't see it that way. I think it's a misunderstanding, but it's too bad. But still, it went on for a very long time. I mean, all things considered, I thought it was going to be a lot more temporary than it was.
Yeah, I mean, Twitter is definitely one of the primary public forums for a national conversation, and I think both you and I were very optimistic about everything Elon was saying in the spring of last year when he was talking about freedom of speech. How do you think that panned out in practice? Is it a mixed bag? How do you see it?
I've come around to the opinion that anytime there are owners of these platforms, that there's always going to be a problem. Mm-hmm. There are myriad pressures, as you know, that these companies come under, not just from the FBI and the DHS, but also from advertisers and people who are doing advertiser boycotts and members of Congress. And so they start to make compromises. And this is one of the things we saw over a period of time with old Twitter, mm-hmm. which is that they would start to do something, they would say, no, we can't remove that, it's not a violation of our policies, but we'll de-amplify it. Yeah. Once they start down that road, suddenly they're doing it all over the place. And before you know it, you have a completely artificial representation of reality. And I think that happens to any company that's trying to make money doing this.
So you testified in Congress in March, and there was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal that spoke to a visit you happened to receive from the IRS on the day that you testified. Presumably a government official, to quote Milton Friedman, who said, "I'm here from the government and I'm here to help." But how did you interpret that visit from the IRS on that day? And are there any updates?
Yeah, so I testified, I think it was March 9th in Washington. I took a train home, Amtrak, got home. My wife very nonchalantly said, the IRS came today while you were testifying, and showed me a note they'd left on the door. It was very funny. It said, "Call me in 4 days." Apparently this is a tactic they use because they want you to worry all weekend what the problem is. So I called right away. Of course, they didn't answer. And then after 4 days, they called. They sent a letter. It really was the IRS. It turned out to be a problem connected to, well, there were two things, but the big thing they were worried about was my 2018 return, which they said had been retroactively rejected due to concerns about identity theft. And I thought this had to be a coincidence, so I just told the committee about it. The committee sent off a letter asking what was going on, and I didn't get worried until I saw what came back. It turned out that they had opened the case on December 24th, 2022, which was a Saturday, Christmas Eve, and it just happened to be the day that we dropped a very big Twitter file story about the relationship between Twitter, the FBI, and even the CIA. So I got very scared at that point. Look, both Democratic and Republican administrations have been caught up in this problem of using the IRS politically. I can't say for sure that's happening in this case, but I think what they're trying to do, if this is politicized, is they're trying to scare off future reporters from going down this road, because who needs it, right?
Yeah.
And that's a problem.
You talked a little bit about the problem with modern journalism. I went to journalism school. Not the choice I would have made if I could do it all over again. But I was inspired by folks like you, right? Enterprising journalists. And there is a new trend in journalism, this idea of moral clarity journalism, as opposed to objective journalism. That is, we don't need to approach any story from an objective perspective. We don't need to get all the sides. We don't need to get all the zookeepers and the gorillas. And, we don't, to the extent we know that there is a moral answer to this story, we can focus on that. So I was wondering if you had thoughts on that, because you also do editorial journalism as well, which is some of that approach. And it seems like more people want to do that, and they want to do less of the all the president's men style journalism.
Right. Yeah, I think we've talked about this before, but there was a very influential column in the New York Times in August of 2016 called "Trump is Testing the Norms of Objectivity in Journalism." It said basically that journalists no longer had to just be true, they had to be true to history's judgment. So this was kind of a clarion call in the business, asking people to do away with the old version of how we did the job, which is more how I described it, which is we don't really care what the truth is. Like the whole point of the job is we interview people, we give it to you, you do what you want with the information, and we're done. We move on to the next thing. We try to get it right, but and then the next story, we don't bring any preconceived notions with us. We start all over again. That way of doing business, which was standard for everybody, is now very much in the past. And people are really doing narrative-driven journalism where they kind of know how they're going to shade things before they even start interviewing people, which I think is very dangerous.
Yeah. We're here in the state of Tennessee, and there was a free speech controversy, or so you were told that, here a couple of months ago involving the legislators who were voted out by the state legislature. And FIRE, we do rapid response work, and we hear there's this free speech story, and we try and understand the story, right, before we opine on it. And one of the things you noticed about a lot of the coverage of it was a lack of context. The fact that legislators had taken over the floor and brought a bullhorn, in fact, on the floor, and were leading those in the galley in a chant, which complicates the free speech argument or claim that a lot of the supporters of these legislators had made. And we're finding that increasingly common, right? That because there's this moral clarity perspective, and because I think a lot of the journalists agree with the protesters on the floor at the Tennessee State House, that just that context is removed. And then you see more subtle things. For example, I was reading the Washington Post's reporting on Missouri v. Biden, and the subheading is like Trump-appointed judge issues ruling, protected speech is in quotation marks, free speech is in quotation marks. And so it's these kind of like subtle ways that journalism has morphed. It's not the way I learned journalism when I was in J school, that is helping to shape the narrative, I guess, toward that more moral clarity perspective.
Yeah, and that is very scary. For years before before I got involved in stories like the Twitter files, I did a lot of long-form journalism for Rolling Stone. That was about the financial sector. And one of the first things that you learn in journalism is that almost every story is far more complicated than you think it is. And there's very little black and white in reality. When you start digging down into almost any story, there are all kinds of nuances. Things are much more convoluted than are advertised. And the trick in journalism, I always thought, was to capture all of those little things so that people get the whole picture. But we're moving in a direction, and Orwell described this in 1984, where in a totalitarian society, what they really want to do is they want to eliminate all shades of gray. They want to reduce everybody to black and white distinctions, so that when they're reading something, they're perennially looking at a binary choice. And that's what I was kind of talking about in the speech, is that it's sucking the ability, people's ability to think for themselves away when they're constantly only deciding between X or Y or A or B. If they can't see the shades of gray, you're left with a population that doesn't know how to think for itself, and I think that's terrifying.
Well, that's what that moral clarity perspective on journalism suggests, a lack of faith in the audience to make their own...
Exactly.
To make up their own minds. I see we've got 2.5 minutes left here, so I'll just ask one final question. When we're talking about the Twitter files, we're talking about jawboning done on behalf of the government, sometimes reaching a First Amendment violation, as the judge determined in that Missouri v. Biden case. They're pressuring these companies to censor their users, but we've also seen efforts by governors and state legislatures and elected officials to pressure companies themselves to shut up. So for example, we've seen in the state of Florida what happened with Disney. And Ron DeSantis gets on the phone with the CEO of Disney and says, this isn't gonna end well for you. Or you see Republican AGs going after Target. They sent a letter to Target saying that some of the clothing they were selling was obscene. They also objected, I guess, to some Satanist clothing that might have been available there.
Yeah, quote, yeah.
But it happens on every side of the aisle, right? And this is why I think nonpartisan free speech advocacy is so important, and that's what we're trying to stick to here at FIRE. You see it happen in the state of New York, where law enforcement officers there lean on financial institutions to not do business with the NRA because the state of New York objects to the NRA's Second Amendment advocacy. So I was wondering what your perspective is on that sort of issue too, and whether you see that to be a growing trend, along with the larger kind of jawboning we've seen that you did with the Twitter files explored.
Yeah, definitely. Just quickly, I would say my perspective on this has always been that this is not a partisan issue, that even in the Twitter files, we saw lots and lots of pressure to go after leftist movements, whether it was the Yellow Vest movement in Europe or pro-Maduro protesters in Venezuela, or even the Green Party. They were denialisted. What people don't recognize is that it's the mechanism that's the problem.
Yes.
And once they build this thing, it will be very, very hard to unbuild. And that's what I really worry about.
Well, Matt, I appreciate you taking the time, being here with us at Freedom Fest.
Thanks
very much.
Nico. I appreciate it. Thanks. That was awesome.
Yeah, thank you.